per second pricing. Depending on the type of acquired footage you will be using in your project, you may come across material that is priced by the second. ClearPost was built to handle this type of material. To start this tutorial, let's learn how to use the per second pricing module. This module will be used in multiple sections of ClearPost. It will look like this. Let's go over the choices you'll need to make when using it. The first choice you will need to make in this new section is pricing type. Pricing type dictates how ClearPost counts the number of seconds used. You will have two choices, unique or total. Let's break these choices down. Unique. If you choose this option, ClearPost will only calculate a cost based on the unique material used in your edits. Meaning, if you use the same section of a piece of acquired footage more than once in your edit, it will discard any duplicated frames when getting a count of seconds used. Total. This is the opposite of unique. It will not discard duplicated material. It will count every frame of use when getting a count of seconds used. So how do I determine which pricing type to use? Please consult with the source to determine which way they price their material. By default, unique will be selected. After selecting your pricing type, you will have a few inputs to fill out below. Let's break down each of these inputs. Here, in the first column, we have two inputs, the less than or equal to seconds input and the greater than seconds input. Next to that column, we have the less than or equal to cost input and the greater than cost input. Let's go over these four inputs. Most archival stock footage has some sort of variable pricing. Common scenarios will be like the first 30 seconds are more expensive than everything greater than 30 seconds. For example, let's say this acquired footage is being priced at $100 per second for the first 15 seconds, but then switches to $20 per second after that. In that case, we would set our seconds input to 15 seconds. Then we would set the less than or equal to cost input to $100 and the greater than cost to $20. But what if you don't have a variable price? Say it's just $20 per second. In that case, you would put $20 in both the cost input fields and any number in the seconds inputs. Let's move to the next column. Minimum seconds and maximum cost. Another common scenario you may come across with archival footage is having to pay for a minimum number of seconds. For example, you may only use 15 seconds of this archival material, but the source vendor requires you pay for a minimum of 30 seconds. In this scenario, you would put that number of seconds here. Below that input, we have the maximum cost input. In some rare situations, you may come across material that has a maximum cost. Maybe you have negotiated a deal where the price of this material is $20 a second, but the maximum out of pocket you will have to pay is $500. So if you use more than $500 worth of seconds, you would only have to pay the maximum cost of $500. In scenarios like this, you can put the maximum cost here. Also, be aware that the maximum cost input will override the minimum seconds input. For example, if the price is $20 a second and the minimum seconds input is set to 30 seconds, normally the minimum calculated cost would be $600. But if you also have the maximum set to $500, the price will be $500. Now that you know how the per second pricing module works, let's learn how to use it to price your material. There are two ways to price your per second material, individually or by the source. Let's break these down. The main difference between individual and source is when your per second pricing module settings take place. As their names imply, cost settings applied at the individual level will have their cost settings applied to each piece of acquired footage, whereas source cost settings, in contrast, will apply to everything used from a source. But before either individual or source settings take place, ClearPost needs to figure out how many seconds were used for every instance of acquired footage in your edit. In doing so, ClearPost will know how many seconds were used for each piece of acquired footage. as well as how many seconds were used from each source that those pieces of acquired footage came from. Now that we understand that, let's learn how to price individually first. To start, we will create a new piece of acquired footage. This time, let's choose per second as the cost type. Next, we'll put in the price per second. You might be wondering what price to put in here if your material has a variable price. Don't worry, just put in any number and click Create. After creating a per second piece of acquired footage, let's click the Cost button. You will notice when a piece of acquired footage is set to per second, you will see the per second pricing module. You will also notice it has formatted your price to not be variable and has used the cost you gave as the cost per second. You can alter any of these inputs to fit the pricing of your material. You will also notice a new section next to the per second pricing module. Here you can add clip fees. Some vendors have fees attached to their material. Mastering fees, research fees, etc. Here you can add those fees. To add a fee, name the fee and give it a cost, and then click Add. Fees you add here should be only for this specific piece of acquired footage. Once you have finished adding your cost settings, let's say it gets used in your edit. ClearPost will look to count up the total or unique seconds being used, based on the pricing type you chose here. Next, it will take that seconds count and calculate a price for this piece of acquired footage, based on the cost settings here. And if you've added any fees, those will be added on top of any calculated price. And that's everything you need to know about individually adding cost settings for per second pieces of acquired footage. Well, almost. More about that in a second. For now, let's go have a look at the source cost settings. To see them, let's navigate over to the Sources tab to see a list of our sources. Let's find a source that has material, price per second, and click the cost icon. Here you will see 4 sections in 2 columns. Column 1 is the clip default settings, and column 2 is the source price settings. But before we go any further, it must be made clear, all the cost settings in this section only apply to per second material. So if you have a source where some of its clips cost types are set to per asset, while others are set to per second, don't worry. ClearPost will add the per second calculations to the per asset calculations to come up with an overall cost for that source. Now back to that almost knowing everything about individual cost settings. ClearPost understands that a lot of the time, a source is likely to be charging the same rate for most of their material. So here, in this first column, we can set a default individual cost for everything from this source. So while this setting is in the source cost section, it's actually just an easy way to globally set individual costs for this source. So how do these default settings work? Let's start with learning how to use clip minimums. Let's start by enabling clip minimums for critical past. All acquired footage marked as per second from this source will use the cost settings you have added here. Then let's create a new piece of acquired footage from critical past. Now if you look at the cost, you will see those clip default settings are now overriding any settings you chose on the creation of this piece of acquired footage. Clip minimums will apply to both newly created pieces of acquired footage, as well as material that was added before clip minimums were enabled. Now let's move to clip fees as defaults. Let's navigate back to our source cost settings and look below clip minimums. Here you will see the clip fees section. If enabled, this will add default fees for any per second pieces of acquired footage from this source. It acts the same as the clip minimum settings above. For example, if we enable clip fees for critical past and then we add a fee, it will show up on any piece of acquired footage marked as per second from critical past. And that's everything you need to know about using clip minimums and clip fees to control the default cost settings for an individual per second piece of acquired footage. Well, almost again. There's still one last thing I need to show you. But for now, let's move over to controlling the cost by the source with source minimums. Source minimums allow you to set the cost for sources that charge for overall seconds instead of individually. Let's walk through using it. Here, we can enable source minimums. You will see the per second pricing module appear. Here you will have the same options as other places you have used the per second pricing module, with one exception. This toggle here. Let's leave this alone for now. We'll come back to it in a minute. As shown before, let's fill this out. I'll put in $100 per second for the first 60 seconds, and then $50 per second after that. Now let's hop over to a piece of critical path's acquired footage. You will see that the source minimums are overriding any individual per second cost settings. At this point, you might be a little hazy at the difference between clip minimums and source minimums. To help you better determine when to use one over the other, I'm going to give you an example. We're going to put the same cost settings in both clip minimums and source minimums to show you that they might yield different results. So let's say we have the following: $100 per second for the first 30 seconds, and $30 per second for everything after that. It also has a minimum of 30 seconds. Now let's pretend you used 100 seconds of per second material from Critical Past in your edit. Those 100 seconds came from 10 pieces of acquired footage. Using these settings with that usage would yield the following calculated price when using source minimums. The first 30 seconds would cost $3,000. The remaining 70 seconds would cost $2,100, bringing the total for that source to $5,100. Now let's put those same cost settings into clip minimums. To make things easy, let's pretend that those 100 seconds are evenly split between those 10 pieces of acquired footage from Critical Past. So each use would be 10 seconds. So we will now calculate a price for each clip. Since we are pretending each clip is the same at 10 seconds, we will do only one, then multiply it by 10 to get to the total of the 100 seconds that were used. For the first 30 seconds, the price was $100 per second, but each clip was only 10 seconds, so the total cost should have been $1,000. But wait, we forgot about one thing. We have a minimum seconds applied, so we actually have to pay for 30 seconds of this clip, which pushes up the cost to $3,000 for this one clip. We will multiply that by 10 to get to the total number of the 100 seconds that were used, and just like that, we're at $30,000. You can really see how the same cost settings have drastically different results depending on when the cost calculations happen, either at the individual level or at the source level. Be aware you can only use clip minimums or source minimums. They cannot be used at the same time. When choosing one, it will disable the other. Now that you have a better understanding of these differences, let's move to source fees. Source fees are one-time fees charged by the source. If you look below source minimums, you will see source fees. If enabled, you can add any one-time costs your source charges. Both clip fees and source fees can be enabled at the same time. That's because the default clip fees apply to each piece of acquired footage, while source fees are one-time fees that the source charges. For example, you may have to pay a fee for every time you request a piece of acquired footage. That would be a clip fee. The source may also charge an account setup fee. Since this is a one-time fee that the source charges, that would be a source fee. Now that you have seen how to add source cost settings, you may be wondering what to do if your vendor decides that they want to charge a different rate on one or more pieces of acquired footage. ClearPost has a solution for these scenarios. This brings us to that one last thing I mentioned before: overrides. Overrides allow you to set a different per second cost when either clip minimums, clip fees, or source minimums are enabled. For example, currently clip minimums are enabled for Critical Past. If we go back and look at a per second piece of acquired footage from Critical Past, you will notice this box here. Here, we can override the default settings for this individual piece of acquired footage. When overrides are enabled, you can add whatever cost settings you need onto this individual piece of acquired footage. Also, the ability to override not only works with clip minimums, but also with source minimums, with one caveat. You will see this toggle here. By default, source minimums does not allow individual clips to override source minimums. But if you wish to allow this ability, switch this toggle from override clips to clip override. Now when you look at a piece of acquired footage from this source, you will have the ability to override its source minimums. All override costs will be calculated at the individual level, then added to the calculated source cost. Scenario: what happens if I've added a bunch of overrides, but our source has granted us a new overall price? How do I remove these overrides? Instead of having to track every single piece of acquired footage that is overriding, you can simply click here to see a list and possibly remove any overriding clips. Finally, you now know everything about working with per second material in ClearPost. Thank you for watching the per second pricing tutorial. Here at ClearPost, we know working with per second material can be complicated, and this tutorial may not have answered every single one of your questions. So if you need further explanation or guidance, please reach out so we can further assist you.